A new Associated Press investigation reveals forced labor is being used to make clothes for at least one American sportswear company. The U.S. government is reviewing the reports now. China's minority Muslims are allegedly being sent to internment camps where they are forced to work at factories for little to no pay. China refers to these camps as re-education centers meant to integrate Muslims into Chinese culture. But the AP's report shows that people are being forced to work as modern-day slaves. So joining us now is a co-author of that report, Dake Kang. Dake, thank you so much for joining us. This is, really important reporting that you're doing. I want to bring people up to speed, though. When we talk about the minority community, they're Uyghurs. Why is China targeting them?
Yeah, so the minority Uyghurs live in China's far west. It's bordering Pakistan and Afghanistan. It has kind of this legacy dating back to ancient traders on the Silk Road. They feel culturally distinct. And for a long time, some Uyghurs have actually wanted, a degree of independence, autonomy, if not outright independence, which the Chinese government simply doesn't tolerate. In recent decades, this has kind of escalated into violent attacks by some Uyghurs, which has prompted a kind of a sweeping crackdown in the region.
So what you've discovered is, as a result of this crackdown, many Uyghurs are finding themselves in these re-education camps that are essentially prisons, and they're doing forced labor, you discovered, making clothes that ends up right here in the United States.
Yep, that's exactly right. I mean, for a while, we didn't actually know if there was forced labor. Initial reports suggested that these were mainly political indoctrination camps where people were forced to renounce their faith. We started to get hints from Chinese state media that people had to work inside these facilities. And actually, one Chinese state media report identified a company, and we eventually traced that company back to the United States. We discovered that it was shipping clothes to an American apparel company.
I want to give people a sense of just how challenging it was to track this story down, because you're getting information from an area of China where these detainment camps are and these factories are. It's really difficult to get there. It's really difficult to get information. How were you able to pull this off?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's really difficult in Xinjiang, as you mentioned, because they are quite worried about outside scrutiny. There's satellite imagery. You can't hide from satellite imagery. And there's actually researchers who have been looking at different locations which appear to be internment camps. And one of those locations was, in fact, what this factory that's exporting to the United States. We found that this factory was actually in a satellite image identified by researchers. So, pulling that together with state media reports, pictures from the CCTV, that's the Chinese state broadcaster, images from that, we were able to pinpoint the location and use corporate records to figure out exactly what this company was and where it was exporting to.
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's illegal to sell products that were made through forced labor in this country. There are systems in place. Where did these systems fall apart?
Yeah, I mean, that's another really good question. That's, I think, difficult to say at the moment. Badger Sportswear says, obviously they didn't realize that this was happening and they immediately suspended ordering products from this factory in Xinjiang. This factory was actually certified and by another institution, and it kind of has a history of certifying companies that later have found to be using forced labor. So this kind of raises questions about the entire supply chain, especially coming out of Xinjiang, given that how widespread these reports of forced labor are that we've been hearing about.
Yeah, so you've been doing your job, shining a light on this illegal practice. What's the United States government doing, and what about the international community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the U.S. government actually said in response partially to our report that it is reviewing these reports of forced labor at Chinese internment camps. U.S. Customs and Border Protection said that in a statement. Other countries, the Muslim world has been fairly silent for a while on the crackdown in Xinjiang. But it actually seems like this is starting to get some attention. For example, in Indonesia, we've been hearing that some people have been calling for investigations into this crackdown in Xinjiang. Some have been apparently calling for a boycott as well of Chinese goods. So, it's only been a couple of days, and I think it's going to take a little while for the reaction to really start playing out, but it does seem like things are happening.
Speaking of reaction, have you received any reaction from the Chinese government?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Actually, the Chinese government, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs just this afternoon, basically responded to a question about this report. They said, they called it a malicious attack that severely distorts the facts. No wonder, basically President Trump criticizes the behavior of some U.S. media. So basically, what this amounts to is kind of a full throttled defense and denial. They said that these vocational training centers, as they call them, are actually voluntary, which kind of flies directly in the face of everything we know about them based on interviews we've done with former detainees and the relatives of those detained.
Well, Dake, good work. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.